So today we're going to look at the art of Buddhism, and this is a follow-up to what we talked about last week or a few weeks ago, Greco-Buddhism, the cross-pollination between Buddhism and Greece, especially in the wake of or because of Alexander the Great invading Persia and going even further all the way to India, only to be stopped by the armies of India and of course the geographical barrier, which is the Himalayas, and for other reasons as well. My argument that I'm going to make today is, in fact, that cross-pollination went both ways. And so I'm going to give you an argument that I don't think you'll hear anyone else make, and I think you've heard me hint at it to a degree. And basically, the argument I'm going to make is that there's a kind of two-way cross-pollination between Buddhism and Greco-Roman values, particularly because of Rome's expansion eastward into the crumbling empire of Alexander the Great several centuries thereafter. And I think that resulted in a kind of contact between Buddhism and the Roman Empire that resulted in some of the imagery we saw this week, particularly the Arch of Constantine and the argument by the expert on early Christian art that we saw this week. I'll get back to that in a moment. So let me just sort of put this into the context of our class, which is we've been talking about Egyptian art, we've been talking about Christian art, and of course a little bit of Maya art, and the idea of visualizing stories on surfaces, on the wall, on a building. So we see that a little bit with hieroglyphs. And remember, your reading should correspond to what we're talking about, particularly the idea of spirituality and art. So if you haven't done the reading on that subject, make sure you do pages 554 and 566 in your reading. And, there are different forms of organizing space on the wall to either visualize history or to visualize mythological stories, to visualize gods and goddesses and deities, and to perhaps tell stories about power. We saw that with Bonampak, the idea of using the architectural space to tell a story about a battle that occurred in Central America, in like 790 AD. And so using architecture to visualize stories, right? We've seen that. And of course, when we talk about Christianity, we're going to be talking about stories from the Bible, and we will be looking at that in depth next week. So before we get there, I wanted to offer another religious approach to architecture and visualizing stories. So just briefly, Buddhism has a different take on architecture. I think you can see that already with the stupa. And the stupa itself predates Buddhism. Yeah, and those were page 554 to 566 in the book for someone who just asked, Matt. So, this is a chance to compare different religious approaches to architecture and to artwork, right? And so the stupa, you may not know, is really meant to be a mound that covers up someone after they die, and they're seated in the kind of lotus position, the meditative position with your legs crossed. And so it's a very maybe unorthodox to us way of burying someone above ground, seated, upright. And so the mound becomes not only just a way of burying the dead, but also a kind of symbol of that person and a way to honor the person who is contained by the stupa. The argument I'm going to make today is very much a way of kind of embellishing or expanding upon the arguments we saw this week on Timeline with the underappreciated Dark Ages and Age of Light by Waldemar Januszak, and also Smart History, the Constantine's Arch. So if you remember, the Constantine's Arch argument they make is that the arch itself represents a combination of two very different styles. One very naturalistic, which we saw that the Romans inherited from Greece, that hyper-naturalism, or at least that exquisite naturalism where you're bringing things to life based on observation and realism, versus what we saw with Januszak, his argument about Apollo being the sort of origin of so I want to argue today that their argument is somewhat missing an important element and this is somewhat conjecture and speculative, that there is in fact a sort of Buddhist source inspiring this early Christian artwork. As they say very wisely, astutely in Smart History, that early scholars thought that the more primitive versions of early Christian art represented a decline in quality or craftsmanship. But in fact, as they say, it was just a shift towards a new style. Well, I would argue that there might actually be a sort of Buddhist origin for that new style. So we talked about that sort of the Greek penetrating all the way into Asia. And this is a very, complicated region of the world because we're kind of at the crossroads of many continents, Africa, India, Asia, and Europe. And this is kind of the path where the Silk Roads cross into China, and people have been wanting to sort of connect the East and the West over many centuries, if not millennia. And as a result, in this area, you have a lot of cross pollination and what you can call syncretism. We'll go into the definition of that word in a moment. And it's an area rich with sort of the blending of different cultures because it is at the crossroads of different places. And I would point out the Caspian Sea is a very useful geographical point to note, because that will kind of be the point where the Romans reach when the Roman Empire expands eastward into the first few centuries AD. As you can see, the Greeks had not a permanent, but certainly a temporary place in Central Asia. And over time, it kind of gradually assimilated into, I guess, the landscape, the cultural landscape. And it's very hard to find anything but remnants of that. And you will, in fact, see that in the form of Buddhism with that cross-pollination. So as you can see from this picture here, this map, Buddhism originates in the Ganges Valley of India, which is, of course, the northeastern part of India, right below the Himalayas, and it expands outwards all the way to China and eventually into Indonesia. So, and of course, to Japan. And you could say into the United States in the 1960s, when people on the West Coast of California suddenly got really interested in Zen Buddhism and things like that. Buddhism, as you can see, really has a pronounced impact on the entirety of what you might call Southeastern Asia, Eastern Asia, all the way into China and down into Indonesia and elsewhere. So in all these places, you see different forms of Buddhism and, of course, different forms of Buddhist art and sculpture. But we're going to focus mainly on this very interesting area to the west, which is present-day Afghanistan, a place very rich with overlapping culture and contact between people from East and West. And traditionally, people focus on the sort of Greek influence on Buddhism, but I want to talk about kind of how Buddhism may have had a big influence on early Christian art. And at least, I'll make that argument today. So I love this map. It's so interesting because it just shows how Buddhism does connect a lot of places that would otherwise be seen as very sort of distinct. Buddhism becomes this way of transcending the distinct cultures. We saw some really interesting examples of this earlier, and so we'll see more of this today, of the Greco influence, the Greek influence, particularly with sculpture, on visualizing the Buddha, right? And we saw, the exquisite use of marble to, show details like hair and, the softness of facial features, and how there was just sort of an allure to this style that clearly had a big impact on efforts to visualize the Buddha. So the word syncretism is a really useful word at ours. You see this with Buddhism and Greco-Roman thought. And I think the question to keep in mind is, it's one thing to syncretize your doctrine. It's another thing to syncretize your artistic style. And I'm talking today more about the syncretism of artistic style, more so than necessarily the syncretism of Buddhist thought with early Christian thought. And we saw that with the Buddha, who predates, a lot of the big figures we've seen, from, Alexander the Great to Jesus to Caesar Augustus. The Buddha is really the celebrity of the ancient world. He's, almost from the what we might call the heroic era, at that frontier of mythology and kind of the modern era, however you choose to define the modern era. And we saw that the Greek influence on Buddhism included things like the halo and the clothing, the sun rays, which is the halo, the very soft clothing, the silky wet look, and how that sort of sensualizes the subject and brings the god to life in a way that's really relatable and or human. And of course, with Buddhism, this is a chance to talk about the kind of doctrine of Buddhism. And it's a really elegant doctrine, very clear and straightforward. And I think I might use a different definition for instead of desire, you might say attachment. I think, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, but certainly the Four Noble Truths are a big part of Buddhism. And as I understand it, it's basically, life is full of a lot of pain. And one of the key sources of pain is attachment or desire, being attached to things, right? So the moment you get attached to your car, is the moment you're going to be suffering, because eventually your car is going to crash or break down. And I'm just using a simple example, but the idea is that the more you get attached to things, the more doomed you are to lose that thing, because that attachment's going to lead to you being unhappy when you lose that thing that you're attached to. So you could either go one way, which is live the ascetic life where you reject all attachments, or you can kind of become a hedonist and just love attachment and just, get attachments all over the place. And I think the resolution that the Buddha found was that you want to use what's called the Eightfold Path and basically navigate between those two extremes by having a very kind of thoughtful approach to life. And I'm not going to go over the Eightfold Path today, but it's basically a life of moderation. And so, living with right mindfulness, basically being self-aware about how your kind of attachments will cloud your own kind of judgment and often lead to greater suffering. So these are some of the core values in Buddhism. And you might compare those to what we'll see next week with core values of Christianity, things like, the 10 Commandments, or maybe the 7 deadly sins, perhaps, the idea of free will. And of course, other doctrine like the Immaculate Conception and the Holy Trinity. We'll go over those next week. But the idea, of course, is to consider, how do you visualize those doctrines? Do you use artwork to visualize those doctrines? And of course, which doctrines are most important when it comes to understanding the underlying core of a particular religion. And we'll talk about this when it comes to Islam next week, when we talk about the cross-pollination between Islam and other religions. So the Buddha is an interesting case of one religion that already existed, but with a lot of restrictions on visualizing the Buddha, meeting another religion or another set of values under the Greeks, and those two kind of having this sort of interplay like a yin and yang. And the result is they kind of a more lenient approach to visualizing the Buddha. And over the next few centuries after Alexander the Great, you see a really wonderful flourishing, flowering of artistic creations that are meant to visualize the Buddha in ways that you see here, with some of those Greco-Roman influence or the Greek influences, like the shifting weight, where you see the Buddha's contrapposto, his left knee slightly poking out underneath his kind of silky robe. And, this sort of Apollonian, Apollo-like influences on the Buddha, but without it looking too Greek. It still looks like something that's foreign to Greece, but you have to kind of put on your filters and see beyond the different to see the similarities. And like I said, today I want to argue that cross-pollination, in fact, goes two ways. So it's not just the Greeks influencing Buddhism, but perhaps Buddhism influenced Christianity. And let's start, of course, by looking at that Greco-Roman influence on Buddhism. So even something like this from Gandhara, and Gandhara was the real crossroads between Buddhism and the East and the West, between India and Afghanistan. You see things like this, which have some of the solar elements that we see in Rome and other places. But of course, the question is, well, what does Rome penetrate far enough into the East to suggest that there was a source or a point of cross-pollination between one and the other? And I think you can see there's a lot of interesting connections between Greece and Buddhism here, at least the Greek influence on Buddhism with the depiction of the hair and clothing. And even here, I think, we've seen examples of, Hercules. But these are, of course, a very kind of a different form of that. We've kind of shifted away from that hypernaturalism to something more, stylized, if you will, something that some might call more primitive, but it's just, I think, a reflection of people shifting or adjusting the style to make it make sense to a very far off place that has a different set of values when it comes to visual art. And Gandhara is a real epicenter of this kind of cross-pollination between one place and the other. And it continues on from 300 BC well into the Common Era after 0 AD, and right up to the conquest of Islam. And by the time of Islam, it comes to a stop, particularly because Islam has really strict rules about not visualizing gods or goddesses. So really the age of kind of this cross-pollination between Greece and Buddhism comes to an end around the 700s, when Islam conquers these parts of the world and starts, literally destroying any trace of sculpture that visualizes the gods or goddesses. So basically we go from that the Greek influence on the right And you could say that that becomes a sort of this version that you see on the left. And we've seen examples of this already, and I just want to show you a few more that I think are pretty obviously, show the influence of Greece on Buddhism, whether it's the nudity or the shifting weight or the sort of sensual robes, and even, the inclusion of, Greek gods or goddesses in the background. So here you see the Buddha with a kind of Greco-Roman Hercules in the back. Here you can see these figures here that I think especially the woman on the right reminds me of like Aphrodite. There's plenty of scholarship to kind of definitively say that the Greeks had a pronounced influence on Buddhism. And I don't want to go into that too much, except to show you these examples here of, a dish with Apollo and Daphne, right? Located in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, right? Near Gandhara from the 1st century BC. So that shows that it's at least for a few centuries after Alexander the Great, these Greeks were kind of fusing Buddhism with, if not, directly with Greco-Roman or Greek deities. Certainly, there's a stylistic infusion by Greece into Buddhism. And Gandhara is a really interesting epicenter for a lot of this because it is at the crossroads between the kind of East and West. And so here, this is from Pakistan in the 5th century. So, 5 centuries later, you still see this kind of Greek influence in Central Asia. And likewise here, I mean, the soft features here are so kind of distinctly Greek, almost like that marble quality. I don't know if this is actually marble, but trying to capture that softness and suppleness of marble. And so whether or not one influenced the other, we'll, talk about in a moment. But, I don't know if you guys remember, we saw this picture on the left, which is one of the early versions of Jesus. So we'll get back to this in a moment. So remember, syncretism is this amalgamation of different cultures, right, and different religions. And, I think it's pretty clear that the Buddha was subject to this syncretism, for the centuries after Alexander the Great. And so the stupa becomes a really interesting way of kind of visualizing the Buddha. It becomes a conventional form of kind of honoring the Buddha's legacy by recreating the same architecture that was originally kind of meant to contain the body of the Buddha. So when you go to a stupa, you're kind of honoring the Buddha by kind of treating the stupa itself as like the body of the Buddha. And it becomes a really unique way of kind of using architecture for religious purposes. And I don't think you're really meant to go inside so much as just see it as a kind of monument to the Buddha. So you could see the earliest Buddhist stupas contain portions of the Buddha's ashes. And so, yeah, we saw this with Christianity, with relics or, different ways of honoring the gods or, a religious figure by perhaps offering some kind of physical proof that they existed, physical containment of some physical element of the sacred subject, in this case, Buddha. And it's really getting us prepared for thinking more in depth about, of course, about churches and mosques next week when we talk about how Islam had a big influence on Christian architecture, particularly leading to the Gothic era, which we'll talk about next week. So Afghanistan is a very interesting place because, of course, United States we left Afghanistan after 20 years in Afghanistan, starting in around 2001. And so, I can't think of a place that's kind of more, further from what we might call the center of, civilization. But certainly, I think Afghanistan is really a unique place because it is so far away from, the rest of the world. But of course, it is central, you could say, to the rest of the world because it's the crossroads of a lot of places. And even though we're looking at Afghanistan, back in the day, it was, part of very different empires, including, Genghis Khan, I think the Greco-Bactrian, the Parthians. And the question is, well, what about the Romans? Did the Romans ever penetrate back this far into this part of the world? We'll pick up on that question in a moment. I just want to point out that in Afghanistan today, you see a lot of legacy from this Greek influence on Buddhism. And here we are, you can see the geographical barrier, which is the Himalayas there, which is, I think, it offers a lot as far as explaining why Gandhara became such an important crossroads between these religions, because of course it's sort of at this bottleneck between the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean, and of course, Indian subcontinent and Asia. And so a lot of really interesting examples of that Greek influence in Afghanistan as well, with this sort of this style that you see here. And hopefully, if you saw the video we watched about Constantine's Arch, and of course, in class this week, the video we saw by Timeline about the underappreciated age of dark, which is the medieval period, you can see that this looks a lot like that kind of style of kind of art of sculpture that we saw in early Christian art, right, from the likes of Constantine's Arch. And so, in fact, a lot of this was destroyed by the Taliban because Islam has a lot of strict rules about not visualizing gods or goddesses because you're sort of denigrating them. And Taliban is a very kind of extremely orthodox, more conservative branch of Islam. And so they make a lot of efforts to destroy anything that violates those rules about not visualizing gods or goddesses. So what we see here is all that remains after the Taliban set these places on fire, or literally, destroyed the faces and the subjects, because that was a way of kind of destroying any of this sort of heresy, which is the idea of denigrating God by putting him into physical form. You could also say it's a way of kind of erasing what they might see as a false religion, a religion that's not the true religion. Of course, that's another subject, but here you can see these examples that remain in spite of the effort to destroy all traces of, the style which, visualizes the gods and goddesses. And here's an example of a stupa in Afghanistan that's destroyed, and I think was repaired during the time of U.S. occupation in Afghanistan. So here's a, Afghanistan stupa. We have pictures like these because the United States went into Afghanistan, invaded Afghanistan, and suddenly we have archaeological access to places that have been sort of lost by time for many centuries, if not millennia. And so it's an interesting example to think about this idea of iconoclasm, the destruction of images, which you see throughout the history of art by everyone. All religions have committed iconoclasm. Famous example of this is the Taliban destroying the statue of the Buddha, which is colossal. You can see how small those little figures are on the left and on the right, and how dominating this sculpture of the Buddha is. And it's got that contrapposto, right? That shifting weight that we see from Apollo and others sculptures from that Greek legacy or that Greek influence. And you can see the view here from, the Buddha's view looking out. Of course, the Buddha's gone now. So this, for me, is very sad whenever you see artwork destroyed. But of course, there's also very interesting cases where, you don't necessarily want to celebrate, Confederate soldiers or Hitler. And so there's very interesting cases where I think we'd all agree that you don't want to celebrate certain subjects. And so the Taliban are destroying sculptures more for religious purposes, but there are many other cases of iconoclasm, destroying artwork for other reasons that you guys have seen, and we'll talk about later this semester. But going back to my initial argument, hopefully having established pretty clearly that the Greeks had a very clear influence on Buddhism, but that it was a kind of it wasn't just sort of an overwhelming influence. There's certainly something still very distinctly Buddhist or Central Asian about this artwork that comes from this cross-pollination. So again, well, what about Rome? What about Rome's being the recipient of some of this influence when it penetrates into Asia centuries after Alexander the Great's empire crumbled? Well, here we can see what I would say is a very distinct example of Greek influence on Buddhism, but still with a subject that's very much, Buddhist, very unique to Central Asia. It's a style that's certainly much as much Central Asian as it is Greek. I'd say arguably more Central Asian, because the subject, of course, is the Buddha and not a Greek or Roman subject or a Greek subject. But the style is very much a blend of that Greek influence, that sort of sensualizing of the subject, bringing the god to life with styles that are Greek, but the god himself is a foreign to Greece, and in this case, the Buddha. So that brings me back to the argument I want to at least consider, which is whether or not the Romans absorbed some of that Buddhist style. So as you can see here on the right, when I look at these sculptures here, and this is straight from the Arch of Constantine, I see what appears to be a kind of Buddhist-like simplification of that Greek influence, that naturalism into that more, I don't want to say cartoony because that sounds too kind of denigrating, but more, perhaps like stylized. And that style, I think, so perhaps some of that Buddhist influence on Rome. You would, of course, have to ask, well, how could Rome be influenced by Buddhism, right? Well, then you, of course, would have to look at the map. And of course, here's the Arch of Constantine, which has some elements of extreme naturalism, what you see on the left. That's straight from that sort of Greek tradition. And then these elements on the right, which are much more simplified or stylized. And as we saw earlier, as you've seen from that video from Smart History, they argue that early scholars who kind of condemned this style on the right as being a decline in style, a decline in quality. In fact, it's actually a shift towards a new religion, but they leave out what I think is a very conspicuously absent element, which is the idea that perhaps Buddhism, all this sort of tinkering with combining Buddhist and Greek elements in Central Asia, that might have somehow filtered back all the way to Rome, particularly because Constantine, as you remember, he shifts the capital of the Roman Empire east to Constantinople. And this is a way of shifting the center of culture east, shifting it perhaps closer to Jerusalem. And that shift also reflects a kind of Roman penetration into the Far East. So here you can see that kind of the zenith of Roman expansion all the way into, and here again, there's the Caspian Sea. And remember, this took place starting in 115 AD. You could see the Romans start expanding outward into Parthia and into what was formerly the sort of Persian Empire, and then making contact with the Caspian Sea, which brings them around the year 115 AD right into contact with the Caspian Sea, where you can see the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. So in terms of geography and Roman expansion, I think there's a pretty clear case that you have a kind of a point of contact between Rome, starting in specifically 115 AD onward, with the Caspian Sea, which brings them right into contact with this culture here, with Afghanistan. And so from basically 180 BC all the way into into the early Common Era, you have this syncretism of this artwork from Buddhism and Greece, and that continues to sort of become the kind of new form of art and religion well into the 5th century, and then stopping in the 7th century with Islam. But of course, by then Rome also has kind of collapsed and split into two empires. But for like 100 years or two, you have Constantine and a few other emperors like Justinian, Theodora, who developed this new Christian artwork. But what's missing from this argument about the origins of this early Christian art is, I think, this Buddhist influence. The argument I basically am making is that you have Greeks going into Asia to have an interesting cross-pollination with Buddhism, and this simmers like in a crock pot for several centuries. And then when the Romans go east into Asia, they're suddenly in contact with this new kind of what you might call a kind of reductive or simplification or a transformed Greek sculpture, which blends now with Buddhism. And so if you think about Constantine knowing that you need some kind of new artwork, new style, or there just being a need for a new style that is a departure from that Greco-Roman naturalism, well, it seems to me that there exists the possibility that Constantine, like Alexander the Great, like many people, look east as a sort of source of spiritual sort of something. We saw that with the Roman Empire, the Roman army absorbing Mithraic religion as it expanded into Persia, and absorbing, I think, some of the power of monotheism when it conquered Judea. And the idea of blending the idea of a king with a divine king. We saw that when Rome expands into Egypt. So there is plenty of precedent for Rome absorbing a kind of spiritual mysticism from the East, but not much said about whether or not Rome absorbed some of that Buddhist influence, needing a new style that comes from a place that is far enough and exotic enough that it represents a new style that is very useful for if you want for when you want to develop a distinct style that breaks from that pagan Roman naturalism that we saw, in Hellenism and from the Greek influence on Rome. And so whether or not Buddhism, in fact, continues out westward is kind of the point I'm kind of arguing that. I think, in fact, when you look at the statues of the early depictions of Jesus from around the time of Constantine onward, what I see is a lot of overlap. Do you guys see any points of similarity between the face of Jesus here on the left? This is, of course, the boy version of Jesus we saw from the timeline video, and the Buddha on the right. Yeah, the bone structure, absolutely. Kyle says the bone structure, like the chin particularly, and the lips for me feel really like so similar that it's really hard to deny completely that there might have been a kind of like opportunistic reaching for Buddhist elements to kind of appropriating them for this new kind of style, which is early Christian artwork. So that's kind of the argument I've been trying to make, that we kind of come full circle where the Greeks influence Buddhism, and then Buddhism goes on to influence early Roman art. And someone else points out the hair and the facial structure. So it's not just like a shift to a new religion, it's a shift to a new style that actually I think is imported from abroad. And I think you have to kind of consider that, well, the Romans, especially when Constantine shifts the capital eastward to Constantinople, which is much closer to India, there must have been, I mean, could you imagine the Romans would hear about Buddhism and they would share stories about this religion that's spreading all around Asia in the early Common Era. And there's, I think, no doubt that the Romans would have heard that there's this one figure, the Buddha, who's kind of inspiring all these countries to embrace this religion. And so the Romans might have felt like, hey, we've got our Buddha, we've got Jesus. We just need to embrace that and accept him. He's our kind of guy who's going to bring us all together. And we just need a way to depict him that looks different than what we've seen before. And I think this, for me, helps kind of add a little bit more understanding to, the origins of the stylistic origins of Jesus, because I think the argument that he's Apollo is pretty interesting, but he's not just Apollo, he's a new form of Apollo, right? And I think we see that new form of Apollo in Buddhism on the right. So this is obviously an argument that needs a lot more kind of scrutiny, needs a lot more exploration. Like I can look into textual sources to see what the Romans were saying about Buddhism, because I'm sure there's plenty of written text about what the Romans thought about Buddhism. But I think there's a pretty solid case that the Romans had contact with the East at points like the Caspian Sea. And I think because of that contact, it's very likely that that sort of Greek influence, which had kind of been lost and marooned from civilization for many centuries, finally found its way back westward into Christianity. And the Romans needed a new style in order to kind of distinguish itself from everything that came before. A very sort of useful way of visualizing Christian art, at least in that very early era, before it has to face all kinds of challenges from empires like Islam. And so next week, we'll really be looking in depth about how Islam has a big influence on Christianity. As we'll see next week, Islam is really the first truly global kind of empire that kind of conquers the whole world and represents a very existential threat to any religion that, especially like Christianity, that's all about kind of visualizing the God or Jesus in physical terms. So that's a good place to end. And do you guys have any questions?